welcome to New England Authors. So good to have you. We have a different show every week, different author, different subject. Our author today is Brunonia Barry. Bru, welcome to the show. So good to have you with us. And you write about Salem, Massachusetts, and whenever anybody says Salem, Massachusetts, what image comes up for them?
Well, right now, this time of year, Halloween, witches, magic, a little wild craziness.
Okay, all right. So we're talking about witches. Tell me, in Salem, do they still have this young woman who's dressed up as a witch, who goes running out of stores with everybody chasing her, yelling, "Witch, witch, witch"?
They do, and the tourists, they run it, I think, several times a day during the summer months, and up to through October. And the tourists are taken to the townhouse to retry her as a witch, and sometimes she's innocent and sometimes not, but they don't hang anybody in
No, yes.
Thank heavens.
So, I mean, the town really hams it up.
They really do. They really do.
And it's a mixed blessing. So you live in Salem, Mass, right?
I do.
And it's a mixed blessing.
It is. It's 43,000 people normally, and I just heard a new stat that gives us 500,000 extra in October.
500,000 extra people
in October, and they come from all over the world.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, but we kind of stay away from downtown.
I made the mistake one Halloween of driving up with some friends to Salem on Halloween. It was the worst traffic jam I'd ever been in. The expressway probably took 2 hours to get through there.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure. Sometimes people just party on the highway coming in because they can't even get there.
Yeah, yeah. So Salem wasn't the only place where witch trials took place in the United States. Of course, they took place in Europe a lot, but there were other cities, and I was looking it up. As late as 1887, there was someone who accused someone else of bewitching them. There were other cities where trials took place. What makes Salem, Massachusetts so memorable?
Well, I think there were thousands in Europe, but it was 100 years earlier.
Yeah.
And then by that time, their hysteria had died down and ours was starting up.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason for what happened in Salem is that they were still waiting for the Massachusetts Bay Charter to arrive.
Yeah.
The winter was horrible, and it was. The world was watching what happened in the colonies at that point, and I think this was just neighbor turning on neighbor, and not enough firewood. It was such a cold winter, not enough to eat,
firewood,
all sorts of and a little very close proximity. Too close sometimes.
So there was a lot of hysteria at the time, and your book here, The Fifth Petal, which was a very interesting book, loved it from beginning to end, talked about a traumatized scholar, and her name is Rose, and she's a scholar, in fact, of this era, the Salem witch trial era. Tell us a little about Rose.
So Rose is one of my favorite characters that I've ever written. She's a colonial history scholar, but she was so good at tracing history of the Salem witch trials that people scholars come from all over to talk to her. She is fictional, but her history was sort of based on the discovery of the real hanging place in Salem, which was it was known, it's the worst kept secret in Salem, the historians say, because it was behind a Walgreens parking lot. And there was very little room for memorial at that time, but it was important to have one there. But they have a beautiful memorial downtown where they would prefer the tourists went. But since we've known for a long time that this was not the real hanging place, Rose's character is one of the people trying to get the memorial built.
Right.
Now, again, fictional, there were probably 15 people or more involved in the town, all sorts of historians and scientists. And
now she kind of becomes a homeless person. What happened to her?
Well,
What
she
happened to
had
her?
some
Yeah.
friends,
Yeah.
younger friends, who came to search their ancestry. They were all related to the original accused and hanged from
Right.
1692.
Right.
And Rose helped them find them, but she also, she was related to some of the same people. Rebecca Nurse was one that she was related to.
Mm-hmm.
And so she felt that in order to honor the ancestry, they should go to the spot where the hangings took place.
Yeah.
She went to the hanging place on the anniversary of one of the hangings, which was in July. And they were murdered that night. Several of the girls were murdered, and
Three of the girls, yeah.
Three were murdered, and Rose was severely traumatized and never the same since. And she was actually blamed by the city for the crime. And so my question when I wrote the book was, could a witch hunt happen again in Salem? And if so, what would it look like?
Yeah.
And Rose's mental illness forced her into homelessness, really. And she didn't recover, and the town then blames her again when there's a murder several years later on Halloween night.
Halloween. Okay, a boy gets killed. We think it's murder. He's killed on Halloween, and Rose happens to be there. In fact, he and other boys are taunting her.
They
Yes.
are, and they're upset that she was not accused and tried the first time. She was accused, but there was no evidence.
Yeah.
And so they're determined to get justice this time, whether they're right or wrong.
Okay, the police chief, Rafferty, right, believes her. In fact, he wants to give her refuge in his house. So he and his wife. And but mostly she hangs out, not really in his house, but outside under his and her oak tree. Can you talk a little about that?
Rose is absolutely fascinated by the sacred oak, is what she calls it, but by trees in general, and by the community that they form with each other. I mean, there are some wonderful books about this, The Secret Life of Trees, and Suzanne Samar did a wonderful TED Talk on this, but how networks of tree roots and fungus kind of creates a community under the earth that's, in this book, it becomes a little more communal than the community of Salem does in this book.
Yeah.
Now, I have to say I love Salem. I think this would be the last place this would happen again, because we've learned from our dark history. But you know, if you're going to set a book someplace about this, it's not a bad place to set it.
Yeah, so in Salem, the trials happened in 1692. This was just the beginning of the scientific revolution. I think that had something to do with the changing mentality, because people thought, at that time, people thought that if you got ill, there was some spiritual reason you're being punished or whatever. But then after the scientific revolution, we had the idea that, well, if you're ill, maybe there's a physical reason for it, or a different kind of reason for it. So going back to your story, there were 3 women who were killed 20 years before this boy died, right? And these 3 women, the killings were called the goddess murders. And can you tell us why?
The girls were involved in some activities that girls would not be involved in at the time. I'll let you read the book to find that out.
Yes.
But some things they were blamed for.
Right.
And they were known as the goddesses because they were a pretty little group of girls who were sort of acting a little wild in town. So they had the reputation of they were just nicknamed the goddesses. But when they were killed, they started calling the case the goddess murders.
And the case wasn't solved.
No, it was unsolved.
So we have one of the daughters of these 3 women, and her name is Callie. How does she fit into the story?
Well, she was told that Rose was dead way back when she was a girl that was present with her mother at the murders, and was taken away and raised by nuns, actually. She became an orphan, and they tried to place her in different homes, but she didn't really fit in. And so she was told that Rose was dead. And Rose was the one person who was very motherly in the group and quite a mother figure to Callie. So I think that when she hears that Rose is alive, because it makes the TV news, because of this second murder, she goes to help her and see if she could see her again and help her out of the jam she seems to be in.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
This is New England Authors. Thanks for joining us. We're talking with Brunonia Barry, and we're talking about Salem, Massachusetts, and I know Salem witch trials, right? Okay, so the fifth petal, tell us about Police Chief Rafferty and his wife. They play a very big role in the story.
John Rafferty and actually his wife Towner Whitney actually go back to my first book, The Lace Reader, which is where they met. And he came to Salem from New York City. He was sort of a burned out cop in New York and came to Salem and became a detective thinking life would be a whole lot simpler.
Yes.
And of course what he finds is not that at all. And he's a little jaded. And one of my favorite characters actually that I've written is John Rafferty. And Towner Whitney was the protagonist of my first book, The Lace Reader. And she was also traumatized. There are a lot of people in my characters in my books that are victims or have suffered trauma or something that makes them other.
Right.
So Towner was other, and she was left a property by her great aunt, and that property also left the tree on the property to Rose. So she honors that.
She honors that commitment.
She does.
And, Rose really loves that tree, that oak tree, the sacred oak. I just want to ask you a slightly different question. By focusing on the witch trials, are you kind of encouraging the kind of mania, the kind of obsession like this this poor young woman who's dressed up as a witch during tourist season and is chased out of stores?
I hope not. I hope I'm telling a cautionary tale. Really, this book is about what we feel justified in doing to people we consider other.
Right.
For whatever reason, outsiders.
Rose is an other.
Rose is an other, and Towner was an other in the other book. In the other book, and I think that this is, if anything, just the opposite. It's really saying we need to listen to each other and pay attention.
Exactly.
And believe each other and help each other. So
yeah, I had another guest who talked about homelessness, and she said that homelessness can happen to anybody.
It can, and it can happen very quickly.
Yeah, it can happen very quickly.
You know, if you think of what people have saved in case of losing a job or whatever, I mean, the stats are very grim.
And in this case, we have someone who was very respected, a scholar, and she's reduced to homelessness. Can you tell us a little bit more about the story? Because I want to go to your other writings.
Well, I'll go back to Towner for a minute. Towner was a victim of abuse in The Lace Reader. Yeah. And she now, there's a shelter off of Salem, which is also fictional, that her aunt runs, and it's on a place called Yellow Dog Island, which is also fictional. But it's a shelter for abused women and children. Yeah. And Towner, when they're ready to come back to the world, this is after they've been on the island for a while, Towner actually employs them in her tea room that her grandmother, Eva, left her. So she's dedicated to helping people who have suffered what she suffered growing up. Yeah. And her father, Towner's father, had started a cult, really, to rid Salem of its modern day witches. And if you know anything about Salem, you realize it's a haven now for people who are practicing pagan religions from all over the world. And it's actually quite a safe haven, I would say, and we're very respectful. But there are people in other states that aren't. And people end up coming to Salem because it's a place that they can worship as they would like.
Yeah, I think New England is very considerate of what we call the other, not just Salem,
I think
So-
we've learned from our dark history, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, tell us about The Lace Reader. You have some of the same characters, but it's not related.
It isn't.
Yeah.
All three books have completely different stories,
Right.
but they all feature a new protagonist. Callie in the case of the Fifth Petal.
Yeah.
Towner,
Callie, who's the daughter of one of the
Right.
the so-called goddess murdered. Yeah.
And Towner in the first book, and Z in the Map of True Places.
Yeah.
And so they're all set in Salem. There's some, I wanted to have members of the community come through each book.
Yeah.
So, so The Lace Reader was my first book, and I wrote that at a rather late age. I was 57 when my first book came out.
There's another aspect which I just thought about, and I'm not sure where it comes in. It's about Hawthorne and the transcendentalist. It's the other side of Salem.
That's in the Map of True Places. In the
Yes.
Map of True
Okay.
Places, Z's father is a Hawthorne scholar.
Oh, that's right. That's
And
right.
he's
Yes, that's
suffering
right.
from Parkinson's
Yes.
and with a little Alzheimer's crossover.
Yeah.
And she ends up coming home. She's a psychotherapist. She ends up coming home to take care of him.
Take care of him.
And I have a real affection for that book because I moved back to Massachusetts to take care of my dad, who suffered from Parkinson's and
see. So
and
there's a lot
Alzheimer's
of
crossover.
true
So there
story
is.
in there.
Although she's
Yeah.
a more interesting character than I am, but
It's actually, you have three very forceful women in that book. You
That's
have
nice to hear.
You have Z, a psychologist, who goes to work for another psychologist in the same office and who becomes her mentor. And they're both very strong women. And then one of Z's patients, who's another strong woman who's having affairs.
she suffers from bipolar
Right.
1 disorder, and she's having some real problems with it. And Z gets caught up in a situation where the man that the patient is having an affair with blames Z for stopping the affair,
Yeah.
and so Z becomes his victim.
Yeah.
And he's not a well man, and he's not a good man.
Yeah, it's a very deep book. I read it some months ago, and you talk about Hawthorne. Did you know that one of Hawthorne's grandparents was one of the judges on the Salem witch trials?
I did, and
Yeah.
that's why he changed the spelling of his name, I hear.
Yeah.
Because it was Hathorne to Hawthorne, and he didn't want to be associated with that.
Yeah, his writing, I think he was fascinated by it, and I think
Right.
like the Scarlet
Well,
Letter.
you can see it.
Yes, you could definitely
in
see
his
it in his writing.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
true. And I got to write the Map of True Places at the House of Seven Gables.
Oh.
Quite a bit of it, because after The Lace Reader came out, they hosted my first book party, and they were very involved in my career. They actually did a Lace Reader tour
Yeah.
for me. And when I was writing, I was talking to them and asking them quite a bit. And they said, would you like to write it here? And so
Yeah.
that was great fun.
I wrote a paper about it when I was in graduate school, I think, and across the street from that house is the Customs,
Yes, and he worked there.
and described his work. And the fascinating thing about the description was the bureaucrats at the beginning of the book who worked there, and they're exactly like the bureaucrats of today.
It's really true. And I think he had to leave town because he wrote about real people.
Oh, did he?
I think so. That's what we've always heard.
I'm sorry, I went off the subject. This is New England Authors. We're talking with Brunonia Barry. We're in Salem, Massachusetts, and all over New England. She's written 3 books, coming out with another book, and we're talking about the Map of True Places here. What else can you tell us about it?
Well, there's an embedded story in the middle of it.
Oh, the
which
story of
is-
the ship,
Yes.
the ship captain.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
it was a
there's-
fascinating story, and it ties in later.
It does.
Yeah, but tell us what
And
the
there's a
story
little
is.
bit of a hint of perhaps reincarnation in the story, I would say. Just a slight
Yeah.
one. So interestingly, in Salem, one of the things that happened with this, it was the richest port in the New World at one point, before the waters closed in, or the silt closed in and made the harbor shallower,
Yeah.
and the ships needed a deeper harbor and came to Boston. But and also before the War of 1812, where there was an embargo and none of the ships sailed, and the goods rotted at the I think there were about 100 wharfs in Salem at the time.
Wow.
And so that killed Salem's business. But they were, first millionaire, first candy store. And the candy that, the Gibraltar candy, I wrote about this in the book, came in on the Salem ships, or went out from the Salem ships because it was made in Salem. And they bribed people in other ports with candy to let them have first pick of the exports. So it was, very odd, very odd, but quite a history. And so I was writing a fairy tale, really, about the history, written by one of the main characters, well, the main character's mother, who committed suicide, and she has been searching for her mother.
Anyway, he does regret it. The story goes back to the 1800s.
And this is also a father-daughter story on a lot of different levels.
As I said, there's a lot of psychology here, and your main character is a psychotherapist, two main psychotherapists in your book. Is that from personal experience?
I think, well, I've been through psychotherapy. I lived in Los Angeles for a while, and I say in LA it's like going to lunch. You have to have a good therapist. And so it's really, and I have a lot of friends who are in that field. So I have easy references for my books. And all of them have something to do with trauma or mental illness in some way. So this happened to be, Z happened to be a psychotherapist, but she still deals with the same issues. So I'm fascinated by it. I think that would have been my second career choice if I hadn't become a writer.
If you hadn't become a writer. So psychology comes through in your the Fifth Petal, your latest book. Well, what you're working on now?
I'm working on a story about mothers and daughters now, and it's very different. It's
in Salem, or
no, in Marblehead, next town where I grew up.
All right.
Yes. And actually not in the town. It's another island story. I love to write about islands that are just off the coast. And this one's a little farther out than most, a little more remote. And it's a remote weekend with mothers and daughters where you think, what could go wrong? And they're mothers and 13-year-old daughters. So everything can go wrong. So.
When did you start writing? Can you tell us that?
I've written really all my life. When I was 27, I wanted to be a screenwriter, and I went to NYU Film School at night. I was working a straight job during the day, and my first script was optioned, and that took me to Hollywood.
Wow.
And never made. But that took me to Hollywood, and I kept thinking I should be a screenwriter, but really, when I moved back here to take care of my mom and dad, I started The Lace Reader, and that was obviously what I should have been doing.
That was a bestseller, the Lace Reader.
Yes, I was so lucky.
Okay, if you're just joining us, this is New England Authors. We're talking with Bru Barry, and I want to ask you about The Lace Reader. You talk about the lace industry. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, Ipswich lace got very famous before the machines for making lace appeared on the scene, when lace had to be handmade. And it was made by women in the town of Ipswich. And it was so lucrative that George Washington came up to buy some from Martha, but also to bring the tax people up to start taxing the industry. But the weird thing about it was, at the time, it was, post-Salem witch trials, and women weren't allowed to gather in groups in Massachusetts.
Is that right?
Yes.
This was a law?
It was a law, and actually, until the early 20th century.
What did people think women would do in groups?
Well, they were afraid. And so interestingly, in my history that I've written about Ipswich lace, the women did gather, but they did it secretly. And there are actually, within Salem, let me just say this, when I was promoting the book, we were talking about secret groups of women. And I knew that this had been a law in Massachusetts that we couldn't gather in groups. And I was told by a Unitarian minister in Salem who was letting us film some of the book trailer there, that they had 3 secret sewing circles in Salem now. and nobody knew who was in them, but he knew some of the members of his church were. And that goes back.
Secret sewing
circles, and that came out of the same tradition. Now, the secret sewing circles have made uniforms for the Civil War, and they do wonderful charitable work. But it really came out of the idea of women not being able to gather in groups. And then with the Ipswich lace, it disappeared when the machines came in and the women went back to being the wives of farmers, and the industry just went away. But in the lace reader, I'm reviving the Ipswich lace, which is bobbin lace that women make on pillows on their laps.
You got me fascinated. I wonder what men were afraid of in women. In the South, African Americans weren't allowed to gather in groups because the white people were afraid of them. They were allowed to gather in churches reluctantly. But a group of women?
Fear is an interesting thing, and that's what the fifth petal is all about, is what do you fear? Tell me what you fear, and I'll tell you who you really are.
We're coming to the end of our time here, but I want to ask one last question. In one of your books, I forgot which one, you said the first shot fired in the Revolutionary War was in Salem. Now tell
Leslie's
us,
Retreat.
us.
So the redcoats came to Salem and were pushed back by some Salemites with guns, and
This was
the first
before
blood
the
shed.
before the Bunker
Yes.
Hill? Yeah.
Yes, just before, I think. And so Salem claims that as first blood of the Revolution. I'm not really sure who bled, but there was bloodshed.
Okay, you heard it here on New England Authors. Forget about the shot heard around the world from Lexington, Concord. It was actually in Salem, Massachusetts. And this is New England Authors, and we're recording here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, broadcasting on stations around the region. If you miss any episodes, please go to YouTube and watch them. And remember, watch locally. Thank you.